Did you know that the tanks in World War I had genders? That's right. There were male and female tanks, and there was one easy way to tell the difference. Stick around to find out how. These are fascinating facts about World War I that everyone should know. World War I is also called the Great War, not because it was a great time, but because it was a war on a grander scale than anyone had ever seen before. No one in 1914 could have guessed it would last 4 years and claim 40 million lives. Basically, World War I was a fight between two alliances, the Entente and the Central Powers. The Entente consisted of France, the United Kingdom, Russia, Italy, Japan, and eventually the United States. The Central Powers were Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. Every school teaches that the war started with the assassination of Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand. But Franz Ferdinand was just the spark that lit the blaze. The real beginning of World War I was the Franco-Prussian War of 1871. Prussia's victory over France led to Germany officially becoming a united country, and soon the most powerful in Europe. This scared France into allying with Russia. In 1898, the German Kaiser Wilhelm II began building a navy to rival that of Britain. The fear of a united Germany scared other countries into forming a network of alliances. So when Austria declared war on Serbia because of Franz Ferdinand, Germany backed them. And Russia backed Serbia. And France backed Russia. And then Britain jumped in. And soon millions of men were marching to their doom. We say men, but that's actually quite wrong. The war was largely fought by teenagers. In the eager race to enlist, many boys lied about their age so they'd be allowed to fight. The youngest known soldier of World War I was Momcilo Gavrich, who joined the 6th Artillery Division of the Serbian Army at the age of 8, after the Austro-Hungarian troops killed his parents, grandmother, and 7 of his siblings in August 1914. In the West, boys as young as 12 were caught up in the overwhelming tide of patriotism and enlisted for active service in huge numbers. Others enlisted to avoid harsh and dreary lives back home. Many underage boys were able to pass themselves off as older, such as George Thomas Paget, who at 17 joined a Baton battalion in the Welsh Regiment. In the Gallipoli campaign, children as young as 15 fought in the trenches. In the British Empire, many young men had virtually no choice but to sign up. For one thing, they didn't want to get a white feather. Early in the war, some women joined the White Feather Brigades. They presented white feathers to military-aged men who weren't wearing uniforms. The feathers were a traditional symbol of cowardice and were meant to shame the men into enlisting. This sometimes led to ugly scenes. On one occasion, a soldier was home on leave, wearing normal clothes on the train, when a girl gave him a white feather. He slapped her across the face and said, "Certainly I'll take your feather back to the boys at Passchendaele. I'm in civvies because people think my uniform might be lousy, but if I had it on, I wouldn't be half as lousy as you." Many British men didn't have to be shamed into fighting, however. They willingly joined so-called PALS battalions. In the first wave of recruitment in 1914, men were encouraged to sign up in groups called PALS battalions, as in sign up to fight with all of your buddies. The idea behind this was that more men would enlist if they could form units with their friends, but this proved disastrous. Having all of the soldiers from one area in the same unit meant that the casualties were concentrated. Imagine having 2/3 of young men in your neighborhood being killed or seriously wounded in the same day. This was repeated over and over again. One town in Newfoundland was so devastated by the loss of life that it basically ceased to exist after the war. Celebrities at the time signed up to fight too, especially famous authors. Given the scale of the war, it's not too surprising that some well-known names ended up in uniform. Among them were Ernest Hemingway, C.S. Lewis, and J.R.R. Tolkien. Famous poet E.E. Cummings and A.A. Milne, the author of Winnie the Pooh, also participated. Much later culture was inspired by World War I. A good example of this is Dr. Dolittle books, about a fictional doctor who can talk to animals. Their author, Hugh Lofting, served in Flanders and France from 1916 to 1918. He later wrote about how Dr. Dolittle was inspired by the war. "It was during the Great War, and my children at home wanted letters from me. One thing, that kept forcing itself more and more on my attention was the very considerable part the animals were playing in the World War. They took their chances with the rest of us, but their fate was far different from the men's. A seriously wounded horse was put out by a timely bullet. This did not seem quite fair. But obviously, to develop a horse surgery as that of our casualty clearing stations would necessitate a knowledge of horse language. That was the beginning of the idea. There were also some infamous people who served in World War I. The most infamous of all was Adolf Hitler. In 1914, Hitler gladly volunteered for the German army. As a courier, he conveyed messages from generals in the rear to soldiers at the front. Unfortunately, this job was less dangerous than serving the lines. Also unfortunately, Hitler was extremely good at it. In December of 1914, he received the Iron Cross Second Class for his bravery. 2 years later, on October 5th, 1916, he was wounded by shrapnel. This didn't sway his enthusiasm though. 5 months later, he was back on the job. In April 1918, half of Hitler's regiment was wounded or killed in battle, but he survived. This earned him his second decoration, the Iron Cross First Class. When Germany lost the war in November 1918, Hitler was in a military hospital, having been blinded in a gas attack. But the truth of this event is actually far more complicated and interesting than most people know. Notes from doctors have made it clear that Hitler wasn't physically wounded at all. He was suffering from hysterical blindness. It was all in his head. So the doctor took a novel approach. He told Hitler that he had been blinded permanently, but he also said that men of great will can overcome blindness if they're strong enough. Hitler apparently took this to heart and over the course of weeks gradually regained his sight. During the war, German culture was pretty much abolished in the United States. German language newspapers, church services, and school programs were banned. Food items also got affected. Hamburgers, for example, were called Liberty sandwiches, and sauerkraut was called Liberty cabbage. Towns and cities that had German names also opted to rebrand. For example, the Canadian city of Berlin, Ontario changed its name to Kitchener in 1916. As Hugh Lofting noted, animals played a huge part in World War I. They were actually a lot more involved than most people know. You might think of carrier pigeons or messenger dogs, or maybe the canaries that were used to detect poisonous gas, or cats that were trained to hunt rats in the trenches. But there was one animal companion that really stuck out. That was none other than Lizzie the elephant. Lizzie the elephant belonged to a traveling animal farm. She was conscripted by the British Army to do munitions work in Sheffield. With her great strength, she pulled machinery, ammunition, and scrap metal around the city to help with the war effort. She was so strong that she once moved 28 tons of ammunition in 6 journeys from the factory to the train station. Her co-workers, especially the horses, were said to have not taken very kindly to their new competitor, even bolting in terror at their first meeting. Yet, with time, her fellow companions warmed up to her and became less intimidated. World War I required everyone to pitch in. With so many men enlisted, women soon joined the workforce to make up for the shortages. Many of them worked in the factories producing munitions, earning them the nickname munitionettes. This also led to an interesting role in sports. After the Football League suspended games during the war, munitionettes started to play during their lunch breaks, and eventually formed teams of their own. After a while, this eventually led to the Munitionettes Cup, which was famous in northeast England in 1917 to 1918. Teams from rival factories would compete with each other. These matches attracted thousands of spectators, most of which probably just wanted a distraction from the events unfolding all around them. On the battlefields, the competition was far deadlier. Everyone was in a mad dash to better their weaponry. World War I caused all kinds of innovations. One example of this was the British Mark I. This was the first tank to ever see combat. 150 of them were built, but they were actually categorized by gender, male or female, depending on their artillery. The male tanks had cannons, while the female tanks had machine guns. We all know the battlefield claimed millions of lives, but the war itself was not the only danger. Epidemics of malaria, typhoid, yellow fever, pneumonia, and influenza all routinely visited more casualties on armies than the enemy did. The most famous affliction from World War I was trench foot. Prolonged exposure to damp conditions could cause infections and tissue death in the feet. There were reports of soldiers removing their boots only to find out that their toes had fallen off. Rats and lice also tormented the troops day and night, spreading disease. And as if all of that wasn't enough, the Spanish flu reared its head shortly before the war's end. It would ultimately kill perhaps 50 million people. Nearly a third of the trench soldiers, which added up to about 2 million lives, were taken as a result of diseases in the trenches. Although the trenches were brutal and the war was grueling, there were a couple of instances where there was temporary peace. One of the more famous instances was just 5 months into the war. From December 24th to December 26th, unofficial truces occurred throughout the Western Front. It's estimated that roughly 100,000 British and German troops ceased fire on Christmas, a truce that allowed for caroling, mass burials, and even gift exchanges between sides. However, this wasn't the only time this happened. In the winter of 1916, on the Eastern Front, German and Russian soldiers temporarily stopped fighting to hunt wolves that were attacking soldiers and civilians. A New York Times article from 1917 wrote about the situation, stating, "Poison, rifle fire, hand grenades, and even machine guns were successfully tried in attempts to eradicate the nuisance, but all to no avail. The wolves, nowhere to be found quite so large and powerful as in Russia, were desperate in their hunger and regardless of danger. As a last resort, the two adversaries, with the consent of their commanders, entered into negotiations for an armistice and joined forces to overcome the wolf plague." Although the precise number of casualties from wolf attacks is not well documented, the threat was significant enough to require joint action. It is kind of wholesome that, despite all of their differences, the two opposing sides could come together to tackle a mutual problem. It is a nice change to see some true humanity between two battling sides. With that, we'll end this video on the nicest note possible. If there are any other little-known facts about World War I that we missed, tell us about them in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, consider dropping a like and subscribe to History Snob for more. It really does help out the channel. Thanks so much for watching.